Um, Good afternoon. I hope that everybody can hear us and see us here in our devices in Camões. We are here for a book release, a translation of short stories of Maria Elsa da Rocha in English life stories. The book has been translated by Dr. Paulo Nelly Castro. He's a professor, a lecturer and professor of comparative literature in Glasgow University, Scotland. We will talk also about Goan literature, and basically Goan literature in Portuguese translated to English. And it's important to speak a little bit about why to translate literature, Goan literature in Portuguese to English. First of all, because plurilingualism is something that everybody is looking for. There's a huge advantage of using and knowing and learning different languages. But personally, I think that we, in Goa, especially in Goa, we have to think in keeping the text at its original in Portuguese, and why? For also very clear and very obvious reason. The community of Portuguese speakers in the world is now around 270 millions. According to United Nations, by the end of this century, there will be 500 millions of people speaking Portuguese, most of them in Africa. It's important that the texts and the Goan literature written in Portuguese in Goa can be read and studied in different languages and as much as possible for many people. Well, the other thing also that I would like to say before starting our book release and a series, some questions and answers, a small discussion, it's about the future of Portuguese language in Goa. As you know, I've been working for the promotion and the diffusion of Portuguese language in Goa, and I think that people, not only in Goa but in all the world, they should look to the Portuguese written and spoken in Goa, should be kept as it was initially in the original. And the translations like the one that Paulo has done, and he will do much more in the future, I'm sure, they are very important, because not only the students, the so-called non-Goan students who are learning Portuguese in Goa, they will learn a lot of culture, a lot of history, a lot of language, reading the books, the text in its original in Portuguese written by Goans, but also other students who don't know Portuguese, they also can read and can learn a lot about Goa reading the translations in English, and some of them in Konkani, Marathi, or in Hindi. So I'm not against the translations. What I would like to suggest to Frederick is that we should keep in mind in the near future to have translations in different languages, making the old texts that my students are studying in photocopies, and sometimes sharing PDF files, having the book, because I'm a little traditional, and having a book, smelling the book, it's different than having in digital format. So if we could have in the future these texts that show so much about the intercultural dialogue that happened and is still happening in Goa, reading in Portuguese or in English or in Hindi or in Konkani, it will be very important and very interesting. The other thing I would like to say is that this translation was financed by Camões and the Direção Geral, tell you in English, I can't remember.
DG Lab.
DG Lab, Direção Geral dos Livros, dos Arquivos e Bibliotecas. So it shows that in Portugal, in Brazil, we are very keen in promoting Goan literature. This is why Paulo, Frederick, myself, and many other of our friends, they are following us on Zoom and others following on YouTube. Fatima, I forgot to mention Fatima. Eda, many others, they belong to a group called Pensando Goa. And this is a project very important, initiated by Universidade de São Paulo. And this project, these translations came in the process of this work. So I think that I've taken too much time. I would like to speak in Portuguese. As you see, I'm always struggling with this language, but in order to be able to be understood by many other people, not only from my students and my colleagues, I made this initial speech in English, in a bad English, but the English that enabled me to communicate with you. Thank you very much for being here with us. And now I would like to request Cielo. Cielo, are you following us?
Yes, I'm following.
Very well. So now Cielo Festino, she's also very well known in Goa. She has been doing amazing work in studying and finding texts, literary texts written by Goans, and also with a very interesting approach that particularly I appreciate. It's a didactic approach of literature, and this is also why it's very important to have the translations of books like Monsoon or Monsan or Life Stories Now. It's very important that we can use the studies of these scholars, the translations we can use with the pedagogic and didactic purpose and using in our programs at Goa University, in colleges and in the schools. I remember just one short sentence or statement. I remember by 2010, 2011, I made a very naive comment to Frederick saying that at that time I believed that we could have a full program in Portuguese language in university using only Goan writers. I was not wrong. The problem was books and studies and the essays on the writers were not available, and now they are available. And I'd like to thank to all these people who are doing amazing work in promoting Goan literature, making the books available to different people, but also, again, I'm insisting, it's important that we have in the future editions including Portuguese as well as Indian languages. Muito obrigado. Deo bore kurum. Now, Cielo, I'll leave you all the time that you need to make introductory remarks about this book release.
Thank you, Delphine. Thank you, Paul. I'm sharing my slides. Can you see them?
Yes.
Yes?
See?
Okay. Yes, the slides are ready, so I will get started. Is that fine, Delphine and Paul?
Yes, it's clear. You can start, Cielo.
Okay. So here I go. So first of all, I would like to thank Paul and Delphine for today, for this launch and being able to participate, and to all the friends who are here present, in Goa, in São Paulo, in Portugal, in the United States, in different places. So, in plurilingual and multicultural societies, spaces which are forever subject to change. Well, this is the case of India, and this is the case of Goa. The heyday of the Portuguese language in Goa, as you very well know, was during the 19th and first half of the 20th century. Though only a small percentage of the population could speak and write in English, still, Portuguese, unlike English, can be considered, as argued by Sandra Taide Lobo, 2014, the mother tongue of many Goans, and by extension, a Goan language. As Taide Lobo goes on to affirm, this was due to two reasons. The first, their role in the promotion of Portuguese language and culture during the colony. And the second, the use of Portuguese as the language of knowledge in different fields, among them literature. During this period, literary works in Portuguese, mainly short stories and poems, but also novels, were published by Goan authors who had Portuguese as their mother tongue. In fact, the novel Los Brahmanes, 1866, by Francisco Luis Gomez, could be claimed as one of the first Indian novels, as says the Indian writer Aravind Adya. Due to the limited readership and the small number of publishing houses in Goa, short stories, poems, and serialized novels were published in some of the main Goan dailies, like O Heraldo, Today Herald in Panjim, and A Vida in Margam, among several others. With the end of the Portuguese presence in Goa and its integration into India, Portuguese lost its place in Goa for being a European language and the language of the colonizer, paradoxically to English, another European and colonial language, but of wider reach and closely associated with the work market. Though, as Frederick Noronha observes in his PhD thesis, nowadays many books in Portuguese are catalogued in the rare book section at Central Library in Panjim, Goan literature in Portuguese has not died out in Goa. One of the legacies of the 400 years of Portuguese presence in Goa is a seasonal literary body in the Portuguese language. And to confirm this, look at my slide. I invite you to read Paul Melio Castro's book, Lengthening Shadows, a compilation of short stories in Portuguese, also translated into English and published by Frederick Noronha, and A House of Many Mansions, another anthology of Goan literature in Portuguese, translated into English also by Paul and published by Leonard Fernandes. With the dethroning of Portuguese, or what the dethroning of Portuguese made even more visible, is that in a plurilingual community like the Goan and the Indian, a language is never autonomous, but it is intricately related at a linguistic, cultural, and economic level to the other languages of the community. Today, Goan literature in the Portuguese language lives on through literary criticism, as the aim of literary critics is to see this literature become part of the field of literatures in the Portuguese language around the world, through the migration of topics such as life in colonial Goa and its aftermath, common in Goan literature in Portuguese, into literary works in English, Konkani, as well as Marathi, through the translation of literary works in Portuguese, mainly into English, and hopefully into Konkani and Marathi, to reach wider audiences in Goa and to become part of India as well as world literature. But most important, to allow Goans who today are not proficient in Portuguese to have the chance to reconnect with one of the traditions of their own literatures in translation. And I dare say that this is one of the main aims of Paul's efforts. Indranath Chaudhuri, 1997, points out that in India there is unity of literary expression despite linguistic varieties. What actually acts as a link among all these languages, argues the author, is not the imposition of a single language or favoring some languages in detriment of others, but the translation of words from one language into another, actually contributing to encouraging an elaborate pattern of inter-regional, inter-ethnic communication. Also for Jean Debye, 1997, literature in translation is more the norm than the exception in India. He adds that all Indian narratives can be considered as selves that do not exist independently, but as part of an all-encompassing self. In other words, in India in general, and Goa in particular, are plurilingual. There is not one literary tradition, but many, that are deeply intertwined as narratives in one language and tradition are rewritten and translated into the many others. I would like to think that narratives from Goa in the Portuguese language compose one of the many cells of Indian literature and live on also through translation. Paul Melville Castro is presenting today his translation of two of the finest books of short stories by two Goan women writers, Vivencias Partilladas, 2004, as well as Maria Salahoja's unpublished short stories in the book Life Stories, the Short Stories of Maria Salahoja, and Monsoon, 1963, Monsoon, 2019, by Vimala. Both anthologies are short story cycles. From different contexts, Vimala Devi wrote the stories in Goa but published them in Portugal, while Maria Salahoja wrote and published them in Goa, and different perceptions of the Portuguese regime. Devi was ambivalent about the Portuguese colonial government in Goa, while Hoja saw it as a paternalistic regime. Both writers delved into Goa's life in the final years of the Portuguese presence and its aftermath, and with great artistry depict conflicts and points in common across Goan social divide. For the introduction to the recently released anthology, The Greatest Goan Stories Ever Told, 2022, Manu Harchetti, the editor, gave the voice to the translators in the introduction. Says Paul Melville Castro about his own translations, I really don't try to improve on the original. I don't think that's my place. I see my translations as more documentary than instrumental. That is to say, I'm trying to show something from the past rather than create my own text out of pre-existing materials. I have a great admiration for Paul's works, really. I think I have read all of his translations to date. And I think that though, as he says, he does not improve on the original, in his desire to show something from the past, he does it in a faultless, impeccable manner. So I believe that Jean Debye's observation applies to Paul's translations when he says that the translated text should not be seen as synonymous of the original, but as the revitalization of the original in another verbal and temporal space. Because plot, stories, and characters gain new life in the new version of the narrative. Precisely, this is the case with Paul's translation of Vivencias Partilladas and Monsanto, in which, with a linguist's precision and a fiction writer's artistry, he masterfully brings back to life, in the English language, the Goa so finely depicted in these two great Goan literary works in the Portuguese language. Obrigada, Debora Colum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cielo. Muito obrigado, obrigadinho. Now, Paul, you have the...
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Delphine. So I didn't want to belabor my thanks, but just before getting started, I wanted to show my gratitude in more or less chronological order to Cielo for coming up with the idea of having this launch and being one of the movers and shakers in organising it. to Delphi for receiving the idea and making it happen, and to friends sort of near and far for being here, either in presence or virtually. So without further ado, I'll kind of launch myself, as well as my book, into what I was going to say. So, translation in the Western tradition is associated with loss, with a falling away from the true original word. From the well-known Italian quip, traduttore traditore, which, with sincere apologies for my Italian pronunciation, frames translators as betrayers, to the monolingual poet Robert Frost's observation, often bandied about far beyond the scope of the Americans' concerns, that, as everybody knows, poetry is what is lost in translation, which tars the transposer as a sort of cultural vandal. Here I want to strike a balance. I want to think first off about what we gain in translation, namely, most importantly, new readers and new readings. Translation, I argue, is best described as a sort of third thing, not a work in a foreign tongue, but also not a work originally written in the target language. It is, in some ways then, both an original and a copy, and as such can reveal much about relations between the languages and cultures it involves. Yet, not being Pollyanna-ish by nature, and understanding that translation takes place within our concrete world, that is to say, in a space of hierarchies and inequalities, I do recognise a danger of loss, which Delphin alluded to in his introduction. Just not necessarily the semantic or aesthetic insufficiently recurrently associated with the practice of translation. A discussion of this danger will form my conclusion. But first let me say a few words about the two works that bring me here today. I don't know if it's possible to show the slides. They don't add a lot to what I'm saying, but they're useful as an orientation point. So, the first is Monsoon, which I have here, my version of Vimala Devi's Monsoon. In the translation, it's a collection of 16 stories that portray the Goa Devi left behind when she moved to Portugal in 1958. A Goa stitched together along themes of caste, class and religion. Now, I think we can sort of move past the first image, which just sort of attracted me for this sort of equation of translation with copying, but it's not important. If we go on to the next slide along. So this shows something that we've seen a little bit already. So we have Vimala Devi and her works in translation and in the original. Now, the first Portuguese edition was published in 1963. It's important to say that my translation is of the 2003 edition, which was a second augmented edition, which included 3 more stories than the original. As I've argued elsewhere, at excessive length perhaps, these extra narratives decisively change the way the collection works as a cycle, by which I mean the way in which the stories work cumulatively and not simply on an individual level. And I think Cielo spoke very well about this, both in relation to Monção and in relation to Rocha's work. Just to give an example of how this second edition radically changes how Monção works. In the second edition, the first story involves somebody who leaves Goa to seek their fortune elsewhere, namely in Bombay, whereas the final story involves somebody coming back from Lisbon to Goa, which is obviously a symbolic movement, to remake their life in Goa and sort of proleptically in this post-Portuguese space. The first version doesn't have that last story, so it works in a very different way. What's interesting about the second edition is the cycle turns full circle. Now, whenever you see these stories referred to, you'll generally see a reference to this first edition. This is the first edition, which I believe is in the library here. I don't know how many of the second editions, which were done on a far smaller scale in 2003, and didn't circulate as widely as the first one. So I don't know how widely available they are. And that's an important point to, if you like, recall, because I'll return to it later. Let me move on to the second work. So the second work I'm talking about today, released this week, is Life Stories by Muriel de Rocha, where Devi recreated Goa from afar. So if you can move on to the second slide, so we have the kind of the 2 versions here, although they're not exactly 2 versions, and I'll say something about this now. Where Devi recreated Goa from afar, Rocha wrote more about the world around her, a couple of historical stories aside. In her work, we see a Goa that goes beyond the colonial, literally so in one particular tale set in 1961, which captures that moment of transition. A good example of the sort of new Goa that comes through in her stories are the set of narratives about newly arrived teachers of Marathi, and obviously post-colonial development, though their lives parallel to an extent the life of Rocha, whose career as a Portuguese teacher took her all over the former Estado de India. A signal difference also is geographical imagination. Where Devi takes characters to Lisbon and to Rio de Janeiro, Rocha's narratives take in Bombay and Daman. Yet despite these differences, the concerns that preoccupy Rocha are held in common with Devi, concerns of poverty, injustice, identity, class, gender. I think we can start to see how, in analysing or picking out analytically these categories, we start to have a basis on which we can make broader comparisons both within Portuguese and outside of Portuguese. And as I shall argue, that's something which I think is very important to happen in Goa, and which I hope that these translations can bring a small contribution. Now, I said that Life Stories isn't exactly a translation of Vivências Partilhadas. What do I mean by that? It's true that Vivências Partilhadas came out in 2003 through Oscar Noronha's third millennium imprint. And I can't stress enough here how, without this initiative on the part of Oscar in bringing these stories out, I think Rocha's stories would have been lost. Right? It was this publication, this individual initiative on his part, which preserved these stories for posterity. Now, later I want to talk a little bit about a sort of dire concept within literary studies of the great unread. It can be quite I mentioned it to Frederick the other day, and he said it sounded very, very depressing. And in a way it is very depressing. But what I would like you to remember is this example of Vivências Partilhadas and the way in which Oscar resuscitated these stories. So one of the things I'm going to want to argue is that although this idea of the great unread exists, stories can always be salvaged, as long as that kind of a sort of a base level of the material has been preserved. Now, where Life Stories expands on Vivências Partilhadas. Vivências Partilhadas has 14 stories, but this collection has 6 stories that featured in the Portuguese language press, but which weren't anthologized, and another 6 stories that Rocha wrote but never published. So again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later as well, but I think here we see on a very practical level how sometimes the kind of editorial work that translation and anthologization involves can sometimes bring a greater coherence to originals. And in a situation where the original's fragile, that can have the kind of danger which I think Delphine alluded to at the beginning. But for the moment, let me talk a little bit about positive things, about what's found in translation, to return to my title. So let me address what I think I have gained in translating Monsoon and Life Stories from my own personal viewpoint as a translator. As has been mentioned already, my day job is as a lecturer at Glasgow in comparative literature. A lot of my research is consequently in the field of literary criticism, the bedrock of which, I think, is the closest and most careful reading possible of a text. So it's quite simple, really, although in practice it can be more difficult. Now, in my opinion, translation is one of, if not the most, attentive, painstaking way we can read. Indeed, the translator Daniel Hahn, who is one of the most prominent contemporary translators from Portuguese into English, and at least in Britain a well-known commentator on translation, has described translation very well, and I think with a nice simplicity, as precise and careful reading followed by precise and careful writing. And I think it's this notion of care and the sort of, if I can call it this, slow responsibility it implies that is one of the great boons of translation. So what do I mean by care and slow responsibility? I mean that unlike other readers, translators cannot skip any words or passages they don't understand. And if you think about the normal experiential reading of works, if we're reading for pleasure, if we're reading casually, if we come up against something that we don't understand, we just kind of skip ahead. That's a luxury that's unavailable to the translator. If there's something in the story we have to do something with that thing, right? We have to, and there are several people in the room who have been on the wrong end of me saying, I don't understand this, please help. So one of my go-to things to do when I find these difficult to understand things is to consult people who know better. But let me give an example of something which tripped me up in a text and which I spent a fair amount of time trying to unravel. In Devi's story Theater, so one of the stories which comes up in, I think, both editions of Monsoon, one amateur player in a theater, so this folkloric Goan theatre form, is described as a polkiste. In my extreme innocence, when I first encountered the text, I think this was sometime in 2007, I think I took this to mean literally that somebody was actually dancing a polka. And I think people that know theatre are going to see how ridiculous that idea is. When I later consulted the author, this ludicrous idea had her in stitches, and she explained it was just being used ironically. But this left me with a problem, what to do with this word, right? Polka dancer, I think, in English would just lead at least unwary readers to the same mistake I was making. So what would I do this? In the end, my solution, and I'll give it here, hopefully it's not a bad one, although if you disagree, feel free to take it up with me at the end. My solution was to use the Konkanized form polkist, which I think is used in Konkani, which derives from this. So it kind of, if you like, it both preserves the ambiguity of the original and it preserves the address of the original, but I think without making this kind of idea of being a literal polka dancer too obvious. Now, a work that didn't exist when I was doing the translation, which has just come out now by Ananya Kabir, it's a wonderful piece of work, which looks at how the mandor arises from a kind of, I think what she calls a sort of transoceanic process of influences. And she has in this work a kind of a long discussion of one of the particular mandors which refer to the flower seller and the polka dancer, the polkist. So although that wasn't there when I was doing the translation, if anybody is interested in kind of following up where the irony or the sarcasm, actually more than irony, that Devi is employing, if anybody's interested in following that up, I would suggest Kabir's work. So, in any case, this quite long-winded quest for the translation of one pesky word is an example of this kind of slow care I think a translator must take, and which also feeds into a comprehensive understanding of the text. It kind of feeds into the way in which we have to pick out the words as threads and kind of see what we can find. And of course, that brings translation very close to literary criticism. So again, one way of formulating what we're doing with translation is as a very, very intimate form of literary criticism. Now, at the same time, I don't wish to imply that no words can ever be left out of a translation. It's one of the reasons why I've always pushed back against ideas of bilingual editions. I think they work very poorly because they just encourage, if you like, a sort of hunt for the missing word. Whereas I think that judicious omission is a secret art of translation, one at which academic translators tend to be particularly bad. But any omission that we do has to be deliberate, and if meaning is excised, it has to be compensated or recovered somewhere else. Now, one thing that translation does, in the opinion of Susan Bassnett, is to reveal the asymmetries between languages, the sort of asymmetry we saw in the example I just gave. Another broader aspect that reveals these asymmetries is the extent to which any given translation displays itself as such. A long-standing opposition in studies of translation is between covert and overt translations. So translations which, if you like, pretend not to be translations, and translations which wear their translated status on their sleeve. I think what's interesting is how what we might call post-colonial texts and post-colonial translations show the limitations of these classical ideas, which are based on the idea of translation as between two homogeneous, discrete cultural blocks, between one side and another side. What different sides would we really think of these originals in Portuguese and these translations in English as occupying?
as well as the insufficiencies of theories that basically envisage the exchange of books between European nation states. What translation reveals, or what it finds in Devi and Roche's texts, is the translational work in which the originals themselves are based. What I mean by this is that the majority of Roche and Devi's stories are about people and situations that are not themselves Lusophone. In both cases, the authors already had to make linguistic adjustments to write their stories in Portuguese, to encompass idioms and the lexis of material culture, social structure, and national conditions. In the classic terms of the Belgian translation theorist André Lefebvre, there has already been an alignment of an outside linguistic grid with a Goan conceptual grid. These adjustments take different strategies. Devi's adjustments are so naturalised they fit within what is basically standard literary Portuguese, which made her translation fairly straightforward. Any remaining issues were cleared up by translating the glossary that accompanied the original. And I think it's interesting to think about this notion of literary works including glossaries. Within sort of a kind of a classic idea of literature, there's no room for glossaries. It's this kind of integration of a certain textual architecture taken from anthropology and brought into literature. And again, I think the way in which that already presupposes readers on different sides, immediately starts to show where these kind of insufficiencies in classical translation ideas can be found. Now, at the same time, what particularly interested me was how it was only when some elements of Portuguese as it was spoken in Goa crept into Devi's stories that they really became trickier to translate. In the story Esperança, or Hope, a character describes a grand family in the following terms: "Conhecem pessoas grandes todas de Pangim," which I found very difficult to translate without flattening or caricature. I'd suggest it is when literature stages a dialectal or sociolectal relations within a language that translation falls down, because the particular configuration of these internal relations is unique. It's relatively easy to move from standard language to standard language. Idiomatic expression is an entirely different story, mainly because every vernacular is marked in different ways to its standard. What I've meant to say here is that, to an extent, both Devi and Roche had already wrangled with the problem of Europhone representation, so I followed their lead. The limits the authors came up against are perhaps Bessim and Roche. In some of her stories, there are whole snatches of dialogue in Konkani, moments then in which she spilt over her chosen linguistic medium. In one story, for example, the particular word used for dog marked the speaker out as Hindu. This sort of thick cultural detail is impossible in English or Portuguese unless provided editorially, which risks the text sounding didactic and marring the aesthetics of the original. My solution here was to use footnotes. So again, this other importation from a non-literary kind of register. So this makes the translation significantly different to the originals, which bore no footnotes, particularly those published in the press. And this shows a very different situation of publication between Roche and Devi. So Roche was writing in Lisbon, already thinking about how her stories could address a non-Goan audience. Roche, writing in the Goan press, was essentially writing for an audience which was exactly bilingual in the same measure that she was. There was no need to translate because people could skip back and forward between the two languages in the same way that she was doing. And also, they could skip back and forward in a way of which I was simply not capable. And again, I extend thanks to people in the room who helped me decipher what this dialogue meant. So the sort of footnotes I've included in Roche both open up the text to a different readership, but do kind of have the effect of weighing them down slightly. So again, we sort of see here a kind of a profit and loss balance sheet. In the way in which Roche's mixing of languages without cushioning is faithful to context, but opaque to a non-Goan readership. How am I doing for time?
It's okay.
Okay. So, now what these reflections prompted by translation suggest are the different expressive capacities of Europhone and Indian regional literatures, and perhaps some of the difficulties facing translators of those literatures, and some of the barriers to their circulation beyond an immediate readership. I recently read Jerry Pinto's translation of the Marathi Dalit classic, When I Hid My Caste by Baburao Bagul, which I admired greatly. It was very, very good work. But I must admit that vast swathes of the book passed me by, as I just didn't share the frame of reference of Bagul's implied reader. Unlike a lot of classic Anglophone Indian literature, this really wasn't a work that performed its own interpretation for the reader to follow. Accessibility, as well as some abstract notion of quality, controls circulation. So looking at a set of literatures in and between languages, and I think Goa is an absolutely fundamental case study for this, allows us to reflect on what can and cannot be easily included in various linguistic mediums. So to give an example of something which I had great difficulty including in the English translations I've been doing, is the vocabulary related to the Catholic Church. So what to do, for instance, in stories where confrades dressed in opas and mursas, who are members of the Fábrica de Igreja, circulate. Now, it's not that there aren't ways of saying this in English, but these tend to be sort of more long-winded ways of saying it, which is fine if we're writing history, or fine if we're writing kind of social narratives. But in a literary text which needs to be, especially a short story, which needs to move fast on the ground, there isn't space to give these kind of long-winded explanations. So yeah, I think it's no accident on this point that one area where the Portuguese language still seems to appear prominently in contemporary Goan life is the church. Now, translation does not merely produce new readings for the translator, otherwise it would be quite a solipsistic affair. Translation participates in what the German theorist Walter Benjamin called the afterlife of the text, so what happens after the text has lived. It multiplies the potential readers of a work, multiplies the potential readings, and so increases the odds that a particular work won't sink into the sad category, here I return to what I said at the beginning, of the great unread. This idea that 99% of the books ever published kind of lie unread today. I mentioned this idea I mentioned this idea to Frederick the other day. He commented that it sounded like an incredibly sad notion. In a way it is. But there is an upside, which is that any book which is findable can be resuscitated. It can be republished, it can be reread, it can be re-criticised, it can be put into circulation again. And I think this is a really important thing to do. So again, let's think about the fate of Vivências Partilhadas and the stories which are in life stories, which have sort of gone from, if you like, being forgotten in a dusty drawer to being resuscitated in Portuguese to now having the potential to circulate, at least for a while, in English. So here, moving towards the end, I would like to consider some of the reactions to my translation of Monsoon. This came out a couple of years ago. There's been a sort of time for people to read and to comment on it. André Lefebvre coined the expansive term refractions to include in a single category all the processing of literature which keeps it alive, whether that be reading, translation, literary criticism, or historiography. Now, the more refractions there are, the more a work lives, because anybody that wants to then refract that work themselves has to engage with a complex field of reception. And I think now what's interesting about these new responses to Monsoon is that anybody who wants to read Monsoon is going to have to grapple with them in order to make new points. And now, one reading that particularly interested me is that exemplified by Jason Fernandes and Selma Carvalho, who both discerned a compatibility in Monsoon with Indian nationalist ideas, something which I have to say I'd never seen. Carvalho writes, and I quote, "Persistently, Devi prioritises India over Goa as the more progressive and aspirational nation-state." I was quite taken aback. I'd always thought the opposite, to be honest. Perhaps, I thought to myself, reading this was an example of Lawrence Venuti's point that translations always make possible domesticated meanings, by which he understands meanings generated in the context of reception not meanings encoded in the work in the context of production. Now, I take what Fernandes and Carvalho referred to, or wanted to refer to, or wanted to criticise, was how Devi, wanting to criticise her own Catholic community in colonial Goa, created some idealised Hindu characters. We might think, for example, of the progressive Dr. Monkar in Job's Children, who doesn't really have a Catholic counterpart in the stories. This reaction on the part of Fernandes and Carvalho, and the way in which it stands in contradistinction to original or existing readings, brings up new questions that we have to answer. How do we read such characters as a Moncard against the background of the competing nationalisms that tussled over Portuguese Goa? How do we read them today, when the relation of Goa to these discourses has shifted so fundamentally? Monsoon, I think, has sharpened the need to consider how we receive Monção in the present day. Whether we agree with Fernandes and Carvalho's points or not, we now need to peg our own reaction to both past and present contexts, which I think will help ensure the survival of Devi's work. The other reaction that interested me, and I wanted to bring here today, came from the Goodreads website, where someone took issue with Devi's use of Dravidian as an adjective. This anonymous critic wrote, he or she, wrote, sounding both puzzled and irked, and I quote, "Dravidian faces to describe Shudra fisherfolk, for instance. I can never understand what that means. Are Dravidians all supposed to be dark? Are they supposed to sport specific features? Or is the Dravidian tag supposed to indicate some sort of caste identity?" This reader felt the adjective used recurrently by Devi to be both outmoded and prejudiced. Now, this observation compels us to think a little bit about how Devi's own idiosyncratic take on the Aryan invasion myth gives her a vocabulary to express sympathy for Goa's downtrodden. On her implicit view, the Gaunkars of Goa were not the original beneficiaries of Parashurama's arrow, but rather incoming usurpers who displaced and set up a hierarchy of what she calls the Dravidians of Goa, the various non-dominant caste figures who populate the stories of Monção and who are described with this adjective. I think it rather complicates how we understand Devi as post-colonial. It's a really interesting point this reader raised. But the questions that it prompts us to ask, and which are going to revitalise criticism of the text, what do we do today with this attempt to put a progressive spin on such an invidious myth? How do we handle this sort of prejudiced anti-prejudiced? Again, here, translation, by producing new reactions by new readers, poses new and vital questions, revitalising a text. So I'll conclude quickly with what I believe are some potential losses in translation, and this speaks to some of what Delphine said in his introduction. Translation always wrestles with ethical questions of appropriation. Is it a speaking for, a speaking with, or simply a speaking over? This ethical question here has a particularly concrete manifestation. In short, there is a real danger that these English translations displace the Portuguese originals. Devi's works are out of print, as I said, and also, as I mentioned at the beginning, this sort of second edition circulated far less widely than the first edition. And I think it's the second edition which is particularly the important one. So, at least in market terms, at the moment at least, my translation has a kind of a much greater scope and a much greater circulation. And so it's accessible with far less effort than the original. Rocha's case, as I described, is slightly different. I think there are still plenty of copies of Vivências Partilhadas in existence. I think Oscar has lots of copies, but they don't really circulate very much. In preparing this talk, I looked on WorldCat, so the kind of aggregation catalogue of holdings in worldwide universities. And at least, although it does skew very Anglo-American, according to WorldCat, there are only 3 universities worldwide listed as holding Vivências Partilhadas, all of which are in the UK, 2 of which I previously taught at and deposited the book myself, one of which a colleague teaches at who I gave a copy of the book to. I did a search on the Biblioteca Nacional in Lisbon, and sometimes it can be a complicated search engine, but if I did search correctly, that came up a blank. So, I mean, it seems like, there's this kind of difference between this book, which is circulating, the life stories, which is circulating quite widely, Vivências Partilhadas, which hasn't, at least as far as I could see, reached Portugal's most important deposit library. So again, the real difficulty or the real danger here is that the afterlife of these works could be exclusively or mostly in English. So I wanted to say a couple of final words about a couple of translations coming out later. So I think it's the next, if you wouldn't mind, Delphi. So this displacement seems perhaps an unavoidable consequence. Later this year, I have 2 more translations coming out, one of which is of Contos Regionais by Augusto Rosário Rodrigues, and one of which is of the collected stories of Epitácio Paes. Now, as far as I know, the only extant copy of Rodrigues' stories, to which I'm indebted to Lourdes for pointing out to me when I visited the library many years ago, the only extant copy, I think, is in the Central Library, which means that this is a very fragile book. You know, a book in which only 1 copy that we know of, or 2 copies we know of exists, is in a very fragile state. As for Paes, the situation is similar to Rocha. Of the 23 stories in translation, 13 were included in this work, which was released in Lisbon, which is long out of print, or Javeliste Codval. Another 10 of the stories which are going to feature in the translation either appeared in the newspaper or were unpublished in the author's lifetime. So again, for Paes, as for Rocha, the afterlife of the uncirculated work may well be mainly an Anglophone phenomenon, an idiosyncratic example of what the American George Steiner calls certain translations betrayal by augment. I think another thing that's worth pointing out quickly is that Goan literature in Portuguese was almost exclusively an unedited phenomenon. One of the things that I've come to feel is that the global inequality of literature is nowhere more apparent than in editing, by which I mean the input into the finishing of works by more than just the author. Authors who are fated and whose work is widespread receive much more input into the construction of their work than their unsung peers. I'm not sure about Devi, but certainly Rocha, Paes and Rodrigues, the only people, it seems, that kind of shaped their work were them. In the passage from their originals to the English translation, while I haven't, as Cielo said at the beginning, I try to refrain from what we might call improvements, but I certainly tidy up aspects of the work. Tidy up things like errors of reference, tidy up things like characters changing name in the middle of the stories. Kind of little moments when the author takes their eye off the ball, which are very easy to do. This means, unfortunately, but perhaps unavoidably, that in a sense the translations are more polished than the originals. Now, the final issue I want to address here is what to do with these translations. The Israeli translation scholar Itamar Even Zohar has observed that translations are seldom incorporated into the historical account in any coherent way. How might these translations fit into an ongoing construction of Goan literature, even Indian literature? There is, I think, an obvious benefit for Goan readers and writers to have a capacious understanding of the literary past. What themes have been tackled? What ideas and ideologies articulated? With what strength? And importantly, with what weaknesses? What I consider necessary, which I've broached in a superficial way here, is think about Goan literature in the context of current debates on translation and comparative literature. Given the heterogeneous nature and history of Goa, which brings together different languages, different cultures, different historical positions and situations, it should be a natural place for this, although to be honest I'm not aware of a lot of activity in these fields. I wanted to just bring my talk to a conclusion with a quote from the French philosophe Michel de Montaigne from his essay on cannibals. He observed, "There is as much difference between us and ourselves as between us and others." And I think this is an observation that might well orient comparative literature and translation studies both in Goa and elsewhere. So what I hope, and I hope this will be the effect of these books, what I hope and what I think is that the potential of translation is that even as it offers an insight into others, it might also tell us a little bit about ourselves, wherever we might be. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul, for your amazing lesson on literary translation and also the importance of having these kind of books translated to English in order to reach much more people, much more readers. English, I think that everybody agrees with me, is not a vaccine against Portuguese language. On the contrary, it's more a strategy to reach more and more people. Well, now since we are a bit, I have to do many things at the same time, but I think I can manage. In Portugal, our friends, they are probably thinking about having their lunch. In Brazil, maybe they are planning to have their, for the second time, the café da manhã. And here we are probably thinking about our Alô Bubi or the Cafrial, because time is running very fast. Anyway, I would like to now to ask if someone here or those who are watching us on Zoom, if you have a question, mainly, especially for our guest, Paulo Melo Castro, confusing the names. Well, it's not an excuse, but I left my house, Portugal, Sunday, 3 o'clock early morning, and I reached yesterday, 7 o'clock early morning ago, and I only slept since then. But anyway, so if you have questions also, I can answer to any question if you want to ask me, but basically, mostly 2 or 3 questions to Paulo Melo Castro. Wait.
I think I got it.
You have come a little close to the glass.
Amal Shamsarwal, while translating Elsa Rochner's stories, have you retained the use of Konkani, or have you tried to translate that into English?
So there are different levels of Konkani in the stories. So there's some stories which don't have any, and there's some stories which start to get whole snatches of dialogue in Konkani, which was impossible for me to understand. I really relied on people helping me. I think it's worth saying a little bit about the context in which she was writing. So she was writing for the newspaper A Vida, which was a Portuguese language newspaper, which kind of survived transition. But I don't know enough about the internal debate, but in 67, 68, it decided to stop writing in Portuguese and switch to Konkani. So if you like, and I think it merged with another newspaper. I'm not sure how long it survived, but certainly within it, what's interesting to look back is how the kind of the progressive entry of Konkani into her stories reflects a discussion about what the most convenient language to be used is. In direct answer to your question, what was complicated was that obviously Rocha was a fluent speaker of Konkani, but the way in which she wrote Konkani was often a sort of phonetic form using some kind of aspects of Portuguese. I think quite different from the way in which Konkani would be written today. So what I did is I kept the Konkani as it was, on the argument that for any contemporary speaker it would be comprehensible, but it would also be a link to the past. And what I did, with help of people who speak Konkani better than me, who speak Konkani, I included footnotes which translated them into English. And as I said, there's an advantage and a disadvantage to that, because footnotes do weigh down a text quite a lot, and they kind of, if you like, they make a literary text look not a literary text. You know, they make it look like some kind of anthropological source. But I took that trade-off, thinking about the difference between her original context of publication, in which not only were the people writing thinking about Portuguese and Konkani, but presumably all of the readers would also be more or less comfortable with the two registers.
No, but I have a different thing. I think that in the dialogue, in the dialogue where she uses the Konkani, I think she's done it deliberately, because that is the manner in which many people who didn't speak Portuguese in the 70s and 80s did talk. Sure. Because start talking in Portuguese, add their Konkani words, go back to Portuguese. And I think that is still happening today. And if that is translated, I think we lose the flavor of the story totally. That is why I was asking the question.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think 100%. I mean, what I was sort of saying is there's this. one of the big issues that we have is who are we writing for? Who is the reader, right? So, I mean, and that has to do with any work, right? So there's a tendency of works which have the ambition of reaching a wide readership, as I kind of mentioned in the talk, to, if you like, to perform their own interpretation, to explain things. Rosha wasn't doing that, right? So she was writing in a very different way to Devi. So Devi was writing in Lisbon, and although she also has bits of Konkani, right? She has an extract from, I believe, the Lord's Prayer in Konkani. But what she says is, they said the Lord's Prayer in Konkani, so there's no need to kind of understand it, because you can do the translation yourself. So in a way, it's sort of slightly more exoticized use of Konkani to mark a sort of distance. Whereas, as you're saying, what Rosha was doing was, in a sense, representing a kind of a real-life code switching. And I think it's interesting to say, I think it's Rosha, you'll correct me, Frederick, is it Rosha's niece, is it Sonia Gomsh, you see her niece? So there's a writer today, Sonia Gomsh, who, if you like, I'm not sure she knew that much about Rosha's stories, but either deliberately or by sort of a process of serendipity, she's kind of followed up that way of writing. She has these kind of very intricate trilingual stories that go between English, Konkani and Portuguese, I think to represent the exact reality that you're referencing.
For Paul, is it working?
Yes.
This is for Paul. Do you think that since you've been translating for quite a long while, the stories reflect the ground reality in Bombay or other parts of India where a lot of the Goans have migrated? Because a few years ago, when the well-known fashion designer Mendel Roddick was speaking at the Xavier Center, he, from this public podium, made it clear that he said, I was brought up in a chawl in Mahim, and I had to spend 10 minutes with a water pail in my hand every morning to go to the toilet. And after the function, I asked him why here. Maybe it's because everyone likes to present a different lifestyle. And my reality was this, that most of the girls living in some of the largest cities was not much different from mine. That is why I brought it up, because there was this feeling of anguish amongst the audience, because you build up a certain narrative, and this thing was going against. So how will you?
It's a really interesting question. So part of the work that I would like to do next is to look at how Bombay is represented in these stories, and it is represented in a couple of Rosha's stories. My feeling, and again, it's interesting, this question about how accurate the context is. It's one of the strange things to translate from my point of view, in that I know the stories very, very intimately. Maybe I know the stories better than anybody but the authors, because I've kind of read them so much and looked at the words. But there is a kind of a gap between me and the context. I don't know how well Rosha knew Bombay, and certainly there's a tendency in Goan writing to, at least Goan writing in Portuguese, it's different in other languages. And what's interesting is to see these sort of the contemporary works which have a nostalgic view of, partly nostalgic view of Goan Bombay, like Jane Borch and some other people. Generally, Bombay is seen as a sort of, Goa is the kind of the small home, and Bombay is the place where Goans lose themselves. And I think that's a particularly situated view of, if you like, a kind of a Goans that stayed at home. Now, I don't think there's anything as raw as the kind of testimony that Wendell Rodricks said, but there is a good description. What I think is a good description of a Kaur in Bombay, both in its positive and negative aspects. So both in terms of the unease of life in those spaces, but also the kind of the community that was recreated there, and the way in which the people kind of looked out for each other. I think it's a very partial view of Bombay, but an interesting one. And what would be interesting, I think, and this is where I was trying to gesture to in my talk, would be to bring together other Goan representations of Bombay and to kind of work comparatively to see how language and social position and experience is producing different representations of that city. Maybe even you could even expand that out into another project, which would be looking at how that how that relates to kind of other depictions of the city and other communities, whether they align or diverge.
Well, now I think that it's time now to go to the third part of this event, not only book release but amazing and very interesting talk. So I would like to ask first to start with the students who have prepared a few lines, paragraph about and some of them they are going to read in English, some of them are going to read in Portuguese. So I would like also to open this session for those who are following us on Zoom. So we'll start with the student from the first year MA, Civil.
Leio um excerto do conto da primeira dele, titulado Incerteza. Diga-me cá, quanto é o dor da sua filha? Irá de querer saber, como deve compreender. O Sousa não se deixou desarmar. Ouviram um grito à porta e reparou que a empregada entrava com dois refrescos e aproveitou o momento para tossir longamente, como se alguma coisa lhe estivesse a arranhar a garganta. Enrugou o doutor, pode estar descansado, mas além do doutor, a Angélica também leva outras coisas para o novo lar. Bem sabe que tem um curso de piano e é uma boa dona de casa. Não é só uma mulher que se casa à espera de ter filhos. Isso agora. Depois, quando começam a ter crianças, esquecem tudo. A única coisa realmente certa é o doutor. Comentou Silva, tentando tirar importância aos estudos de piano.
We have some friends of us. I think that they want to read some part of the book, life stories of Monsoon, or maybe they have a question. I saw Adelaide. Yeah, switch on your microphone, please. Microphone forward. O microfone não está. Sim. Nós estamos ouvindo, agora pode falar. Sim, vai.
Já posso?
Sim.
Já pode. I would like Paul to develop the idea that for me it's a bit, I never thought about it like that, to develop the idea that connects literary criticism with translation. In what way that happens?
Yeah, so I think it's that idea that I think one of the a problem with some contemporary literary criticism is that it goes to, I think sometimes it goes past the book too quickly. It goes kind of past the book and kind of jumps into context, and I think perhaps especially in post-colonial criticism, the book becomes a way of a kind of starting point to then, to then talk about history, to talk about sociology, to talk about something else. And I think what I personally think is that literary criticism has to start with the text. It has to appreciate books for their aesthetics, for how they're working as short stories, how they're working as novels, and for all of the architecture of literature, kind of things to do with point of view, to do with metaphorics, to do with stylistics. And I think, if you translate a book, it's almost like you're kind of taking it apart and putting it back together again yourself. So you get this kind of, it's like it's sort of reading the book from the inside out, which I think is a good way of preventing that kind of too quick interpretation. You kind of have to go slowly. And I gave some examples of a couple of words where you can't just jump over them. You've got to think about not just and it becomes a more careful way of moving on to context, because you're going through the details of the text rather than kind of using the text as a springboard you can just kind of jump off of. So yeah, I think in a sense it's that. It's beginning literary criticism with this very careful understanding of how the text works on its own terms, and not just kind of looking to the text for what we want to get out of it, which I think happens, unfortunately, too easily sometimes.
Okay, thank you, Paul.
So we come down again to North, to Goa, and I will invite now Saloni to read a little bit from one of his books.
Hola, voy a leer un conto de Vimla Devi, Fidelidad. Chandrakanta teve um sorriso contrariado. Luísa continuou a falar. 14 anos, meu Deus, não há direito, não passa de uma criança. Que sabe uma rapariga aos 14 anos? Sabe uma coisa, pelo menos, murmurou Chandrakanta. Uma coisa? Continuar. Continua? Pergunta ela, fazendo a testa e ficando olhos juntos. Há muitas coisas que não podes compreender, disse o rapaz. Ela estendeu uma perna, esticando bem a meia e largo a falar. Mas 14 anos, claro, não admira que andes por aí. Um casamento desses não tem a razão de ser. Nem sequer tiverão noite de núpcias não consumados. É sumário, sem complicações. Depois podemos tirar medicina tropical e irmos para a África. Não gostavas? Os dois fazíamos bom dinheiro. Chandra.
I think this is about Cielo. You had your hand, you raised your hand, now it's down. You want to say something or read some?
Now I wanted to make a comment that Paul did a survey to see in what libraries he could find the books. So I don't know if there is a copy, if anyone perhaps knows better, of Vimla Devi or Margaret Saraposha Nuspi. But although there are no copies of the book in the library, the students know the books. Because Elder taught a course on Goan literature, and the students are very well acquainted with the two authors. Aren't they, Elder?
Elder, the microphone, please.
Yes, we give courses here about Goan literature or Portuguese. Paul was here once, yes, giving words too. Okay, yes. And we circulate this in PDF and things like that, in fact. But, okay, we do it.
Also, my students at Universidad Federal de Tocantins, they are also acquainted with Bimala Devi, and one or two of the students published essays on Bimala Devi's book. So what I mean is that although the copies of the book might not be in the libraries, many students, at least here in Brazil, they are acquainted with Bimala Devi's works, and Maria Sana Rocha too, in the Portuguese language, of course.
Yeah, I think that's great. What I was thinking, we had, because in a sense, what that's producing is people who you're sharing the work with, which is fantastic. What I was thinking more about was how, and this might be quite an academic thing, but how people who don't know Devi or Rocha, how they discover it. So it's interesting, Duarte and I have been, so Duarte Braga, a colleague of mine from Portugal, so Duarte and I have been organising a volume of essays, a journal volume of Luso-Asian writing. We've had various kind of submissions from various parts of the world. A couple of people submitted from America, and it was really interesting to see what they'd chosen to write about. And you see how, to an extent, what people, and this has to do with this idea of the great unread, the idea of refractions, how what people end up writing about is partly dependent on what they can find. Right? So when they go to their library or when they search online, then what can they find? And I think it's very easy to spend other people's time, it's very easy to spend other people's money. What would be great is if these works, not just in Portuguese, but also Kigo works in English and other kind of, makes it more difficult in Konkani or Marathi, but if they were in the main deposit libraries, so that when somebody becomes interested in something, they can sort of start searching, they can find it. And it's probably worth saying a word here about how I first became interested in kind of Goan writing. It was with Bimala Devi's A Literatura em Portuguesa. And one of the things about this work, so A Literatura em Portuguesa, is this big 2-volume work that Devi and her husband, Manuel de Seabra, wrote in Portugal in the early 1970s. And one of it is a big essay. It's not just about Goan literature, but also about Goan society, Goan history. And the second is this big anthology of Goan writing, which goes from kind of centuries back up until their present day. And what's interesting about this book is that almost every single research or academic research library in England has a copy, right? And like lots of people I know have become interested because they've kind of searched and tried to find something and then found that copy. And I guess what I was trying to say is that it's great that like you're circulating these PDFs with students, but it's having hoardings in the library which carries things forward into the future. Because PDFs disappear, right? I keep losing my own stupidly.
It's true, absolutely true. I will donate my copies to Usman.
Well, once again, I don't know if there's any other question from those who are on my right. I ask people to sit on the left because of the camera. Anyway, we can do some gymnastic. And any question or anyone wants to read short text? Yes.
Hi, Paul. When you translate it in the same period also. Say English, say 1920s, it would be 1920s English. But how would a reader of the 2023, for example, understand that language? I find it difficult.
So that's a really difficult question, but a really good question. And it's one I'm grappling with at the moment, because the work that brought me here was precisely Goan author from the 1920s. And that does kind of give you which language do you translate into? Do you try to sort of do a pastiche of past language, and in a way that produces a hostage to fortune? It's how well you can pastiche in English 100 years ago without anachronisms, without all sorts of difficulties. Or do you translate it into a very, very modern idiom, risking a kind of an inverse sort of anachronism, right? Somebody sounding like them, kind of dressed like me today rather than in a kind of top hats and tails in the 1920s. I think, in a sense, what you do with historical language is what you have to do with dialects and sociolects. I think that is one of the places where there is a kind of flattening in translation, where you have to try to get a neutral language. It doesn't sound like it's from today, it also doesn't sound like it's necessarily from before. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things, one of the interesting things about translation is that translations age in a way that originals don't. So we keep doing translations, right? That's why if you think about something like Great Greek classics, every generation seems to translate it for themselves. Because each generation has the need for an accessibility to that text. Whereas nobody translates Shakespeare into modern English. If they do, well, maybe they do, but how well it works. I mean, there is that idea that the original is a kind of historical document that doesn't evolve, whereas the translation has to be redone. So yeah, I think the short answer is there's not an easy answer. I sometimes think of translation as a little bit like that circus trick where there's lots of plates spinning. You've got to try to keep as many plates spinning as you can, but always a couple fall off. Just hope they don't all crash to the ground and smash the smithereens.
Thank you.
Well, it's our friends from Portugal. They are Atletas still skipping the lunch. So I propose, if nobody else wants to read, so I will request now another student from Go University. By the way, Go University, all the students, our students, they are Indian students. There's no Goans or non-Goan students. They are all Indian students. Some of them, they were born in Goa and they live in Goa for at least 20 years, right? So, for instance, MA program, we have 13 students, 8 of them, they were born in Goa, 5 of them, they came from other states. Just to make clear that sometimes we read things which are not exactly the real picture. So now, Gyanendra, one of the students who came from another state, is doing MA at the Go University. So I request Gyanendra to read a short text from Monsoon.
Who wants the mic?
Oh, we need microphone.
Boa tarde a todos. Eu vou ler um certo de Nação de Vimanade, Dhruva. Voltado para o Oriente, Dhruva cogitava no seu destino. Pela primeira vez, desde o Tali, sentia medo. Até aí tudo fora encantamento. Sonho verde que desenhava Katoas. Tudo atemorizava. O outro, os condenados que devastavam familiarmente toda a casa. A sogra em perigo. Ao sorvente, o sogro, o caco, todos o próprio marido. Tiveram estranho arrepio ao sentir as mãos do Chandrakanta, atando a 3 mãos. O Tali ao seu despojo, mas ao mesmo tempo admirava-se daquela sua veste. Ainda mal tinha coragem de encarar aquele desconhecido que era agora o seu marido. E não achava uma razão que justificasse o seu estado de espírito. As leis tinham-se cumprido e tudo decorrera como sempre. Nada havia de estranho, de diferente. Lembrava-se de como se sentira a rapariga mais feliz da aldeia, ao saber, através do pai que estava arranjado o seu casamento com um rapaz da família de Chá. Uma das melhores casas do conselho, no estado, incluindo, lembrava-se também do dia em que enfeitara a sua longa trança, geles de abolis e gelos para anunciar noivado aos parentes e amigos, recordava tudo, a alegria dos pais do tio, todos ansiosos e contentes, a inveja das raparigas da sua idade. A ovelha, a estar tão feliz, viraram-lhe às costas os dias do encantamento que precederam. O tal sonhos, esperanças trêmulas que davam lugar a esta sensação de estranheza perante o desconhecido. Muito obrigado.
Now I'll speak in Portuguese. Pronto, chegamos ao fim, penso eu. I think we reached the end. And I'd just like to show you the books of the Monsoon, published in English, and life stories, the recent translation of Paulo de Castro, thanks to the great job of Frederick Bologna. He's always behind the scenes, making this possible, making these books reachable to all people everywhere in the world. And I'm sure that if our students, instead of reading on mobile, on PDF, if they can feel the text, smell, I'm sure that they will be not better students, but in the future better writers, better Indians, better citizens, and everybody will be much happier. Muito obrigado, Deu Borei Peru, and Happy New Year to all of you. Thank you.